I lie here in the ICU machines beeping frantically around me as I slip in and out of consciousness. Through the haze, I hear Dr. Martinez telling my parents the devastating news my condition has worsened critically, and tonight might be my last. I expect to feel their hands holding mine, hear their reassuring voices. Instead, I hear my mother's sharp response. We understand, but Jason's graduation party is tonight. We've already committed. Can't you just keep her stable until tomorrow? The words hit harder than any physical pain I've ever experienced. My name is Aleida Henderson, and I'm 28 years old. As I stare at the sterile, white ceiling tiles above my hospital bed, listening to the rhythmic beeping of monitors that are keeping me alive, I can't help but think about how we got here. This isn't the first time I've been abandoned for Jason's achievements, and the painful truth is that I should have seen this coming. Growing up in Springfield, Oregon, I was always the invisible daughter in the Henderson family. While my brother Jason excelled at football academics and every social event he touched, I struggled with chronic health issues that began when I was just 15 years old. The signs were always there, but my parents were too busy celebrating Jason's latest touchdown or honor roll achievement to notice their daughter slowly fading away. I remember my 16th birthday like it was yesterday. I had been planning a small party with a few friends from school, nothing elaborate, just cake and maybe some movies in our living room. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, especially because it would be one of the few times my parents would focus entirely on me. But that morning, Jason's football coach called with news that there was a last-minute spot available in a regional championship game. Without hesitation, my parents packed up the entire family and drove 3 hours to watch Jason play. Aleida, honey, we'll celebrate your birthday next weekend, my mother had said while rushing around the house gathering Jason's gear. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for your brother. I spent my 16th birthday alone eating store-bought cupcakes while my friends called to ask where everyone was. When my family returned that night, exhausted from cheering for Jason, they had forgotten to even ask how my day went. Then, there was my college graduation ceremony. I had worked incredibly hard to earn my business degree from Oregon State University, often studying through painful episodes that left me dizzy and nauseous. I graduated summa cum laude, something that should have made any parent proud. But the weekend of my graduation happened to coincide with Jason needing help moving into his new apartment in Portland. "Sweetheart, you'll understand when you're older," my father had explained over the phone. "Jason needs our help right now, and you're strong enough to handle your graduation on your own. We'll take you out for a nice dinner next time we're in town." I sat alone in that auditorium, watching other families cheer and take photos while I collected my diploma, with no one there to witness the moment. I told myself that at least I had accomplished something meaningful, but the empty seats where my parents should have been sitting felt like a physical weight on my chest. The pattern continued through every major milestone in my life. When I got married to David 3 years ago, my parents spent a whopping $50 on our wedding gift, while they had contributed $20,000 to Jason's elaborate destination wedding in Hawaii the year before. When David and I bought our first house, they sent a congratulations card. When Jason bought his house, they co-signed the mortgage and helped with the down payment. I always told myself that maybe, if something truly serious happened to me, my parents would finally realize my worth. I imagined that if I were ever in real danger, they would drop everything and rush to my side. I pictured them holding my hand, telling me how much I meant to them, how sorry they were for all the years of neglect. Now lying here with tubes in my arms and oxygen flowing through my nose, I realize how foolish that hope was. The machines around me serve as a harsh reminder that even facing death, I still come second to Jason's achievements. The heart monitor shows my irregular rhythm, the IV drips medication into my bloodstream to keep my blood pressure stable, and the oxygen saturation alarm keeps going off because my body is struggling to function properly. Dr. Martinez returns to check on me, his face grave with concern. He's a kind man in his 50s who has been incredibly patient with my case, even though my parents have shown little interest in understanding my condition. Through my partially closed eyes, I watch him review my charts and shake his head slightly. A nurse enters the room, Patricia, who has been my guardian angel throughout this ordeal. She's probably around 40 with gentle hands and a warm smile that makes me feel less alone. She adjusts my pillow and checks my IV line with the care that a mother should show her dying daughter. "How are you feeling, honey?" Patricia asks softly, her voice full of genuine concern that I've never heard from my own family. I try to speak, but my throat is dry and scratchy from the breathing tube they had to insert earlier. Patricia immediately brings me ice chips and helps me moisten my mouth. "Has anyone called my parents back?" I manage to whisper. Patricia's expression tells me everything I need to know before she even speaks. "We've tried several times, sweetheart. The last time we reached your mother, she said they would try to visit tomorrow after the party wraps up." Tomorrow, after the party wraps up, not immediately. Not with the urgency that a parent should feel when their child might be dying, after the party. The next twist in this nightmare came when Dr. Martinez returned with my latest test results, and the news was worse than I could have imagined. As I lay there watching him approach my bed with a folder thick with lab reports and scan images, I knew my life was about to change forever. "Aleida, I have your genetic testing results," Dr. Martinez said, pulling up a chair beside my bed. His voice carried the weight of someone about to deliver life-altering information. "You have a condition called hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia, or HHT for short." The words meant nothing to me at first, but as he began explaining the disease, a cold dread settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with my current medical crisis. HHT is a genetic disorder that affects blood vessels throughout your body. He continued showing me images of the abnormal vessels that had been growing inside me for years. "It causes arteriovenous malformations, which are essentially abnormal connections between your arteries and veins. These can be life-threatening if they rupture, which is what happened to you." I stared at the medical images on his tablet, seeing the tangled web of blood vessels that had been silently threatening my life. But what Dr. Martinez said next made my blood run cold. "The thing is, Aleida, HHT is hereditary. Someone in your family must have this condition or at least carry the gene. Has anyone in your family ever mentioned having frequent nosebleeds, shortness of breath, or iron deficiency anemia?" My mind immediately went to my mother. Growing up, I had watched her have mysterious nosebleeds that she always dismissed as dry air or stress. She constantly complained about being tired and took iron supplements religiously. My grandmother on my mother's side had died young from what the family always described as complications from a lung condition, but no one ever went into detail about what that meant. "My mother," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "she has nosebleeds all the time." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. The concerning thing is that with early detection and proper monitoring, many of the complications you're experiencing now could have been prevented or managed much more effectively." That's when the true horror of my situation became clear. For years, I had been experiencing symptoms that my parents dismissed as attention-seeking behavior or dramatic teenage nonsense. The frequent nosebleeds that started when I was 15, the constant fatigue that made it hard for me to keep up in school, the fainting spells that happened during physical activity. All of it could have been diagnosed and treated if anyone had taken my complaints seriously. I remembered countless conversations with my mother about my symptoms. "Stop being so dramatic, Aleida," she would say when I complained about feeling dizzy or weak. "Jason plays football and gets actual injuries, and he doesn't complain half as much as you do." When I fainted during my high school PE class, they made me sit out for the day, but never followed up with any medical testing. "You could have been monitored for vascular malformations." Dr. Martinez explained, his voice gentle but firm. Regular screenings could have detected the problematic vessels before they became life-threatening. Iron supplementation could have prevented the severe anemia you developed. Most importantly, you could have been educated about warning signs and when to seek immediate medical attention. The irony was devastating. While my parents were spending thousands of dollars on Jason's sports equipment training camps and athletic scholarships, I was developing a potentially fatal condition that went completely ignored. They had taken Jason to the emergency room 3 times for minor sports injuries. But when I collapsed at school from anemia, they told me to drink more orange juice and get more sleep. Patricia, who had been quietly listening to Dr. Martinez's explanation, spoke up with a question that had been haunting me. How long has this condition been affecting her, doctor? But based on the extent of the vascular malformations and her medical history, I'd estimate she's been symptomatic for at least 10 to 12 years, he replied. The severity we're seeing now suggests this has been building for quite some time. 12 years. 12 years of symptoms that were dismissed, ignored, or attributed to my supposedly dramatic personality. 12 years of my body sending distress signals that no one bothered to investigate. 12 years during which proper medical care could have prevented me from lying in this ICU bed, fighting for my life, while my parents attended a party. Patricia squeezed my hand gently after Dr. Martinez left to update my charts. "I'm so sorry, honey," she said, and I could see genuine anger in her eyes on my behalf. "No child should have to go through what you've been through." Her kindness broke something open inside me that I had been keeping tightly controlled. For the first time since this crisis began, I started to cry. Not just tears of fear or pain, but tears of grief for the healthy life I could have had if anyone had loved me enough to pay attention. "They knew," I whispered through my tears. "My mother has the same symptoms. She had to have known something was wrong with me, too." Patricia pulled tissues from the bedside table and gently wiped my face. "Some people are so caught up in their own world that they can't see what's right in front of them," she said. "But that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it your fault." As I lay there processing this revelation, I realized that my parents' neglect wasn't just emotional abuse. It was medical neglect that had literally put my life in danger. Their obsession with Jason's achievements had blinded them to their daughter's deteriorating health, and now I was paying the ultimate price for their willful ignorance. The monitors around me continued their rhythmic beeping, marking time while my body fought to survive a crisis that should have been prevented years ago. Meanwhile, somewhere across town, my parents were probably toasting Jason's success, completely unaware that their negligence had nearly killed their daughter. The crushing blow came when I overheard my mother's phone conversation in the hallway outside my room, and I discovered that everything I thought I knew about Jason's party was a lie. The revelation hit me like a physical assault, making my already labored breathing even more difficult. My mother was speaking loudly enough that her voice carried clearly into my room, apparently unconcerned about who might overhear her excited chatter about the evening's festivities. "Oh, Martha, you should see the venue we rented for tonight," my mother gushed into her phone. "The ballroom at the Grand Plaza Hotel looks absolutely stunning with all the decorations. We spent $3,000 just on flowers and lighting." I felt my heart rate spike and the monitors began beeping more frantically. This wasn't a simple graduation party. The Grand Plaza Hotel was the most expensive venue in Springfield, the kind of place people rented for major celebrations. "Jason looked so handsome when he tried on his new suit," she continued. "We got him the best one from Nordstrom, $600, but he's worth every penny. Regional manager at 25 years old, can you believe it? Our boy is going to be running the entire Pacific Northwest division of Henderson Construction." The words hit me like a series of physical blows. Regional manager, Henderson Construction, my father's company, the same position that had been promised to me when I earned my business degree 3 years ago. I remembered that conversation with perfect clarity because it had given me hope during some of my darkest moments in college. I had been struggling with my undiagnosed condition, barely able to stay awake during classes when my father called to check on my grades. "You keep working hard, sweetheart," he had said with what I thought was genuine pride in his voice. "When you graduate, there's going to be a place for you at Henderson Construction. Work your way up, prove yourself, and this company will be yours someday. It's going to be the Henderson legacy." I had clung to those words through every difficult semester, every episode of illness that made my studies nearly impossible. I imagined working alongside my father, finally earning his respect and approval. I pictured myself growing into the leadership role he had promised, building something meaningful together. Instead, Jason had been handed the exact position I was supposed to work toward, and he had received it immediately after his college graduation, despite having no relevant experience in construction or business management. While I had earned my degree with honors, despite battling an undiagnosed chronic illness, Jason had coasted through a general communications degree at a state school where my parents paid for everything. "The caterers are setting up right now," my mother continued her phone conversation. "We ordered prime rib for 50 guests, an open bar, and that chocolate fountain Jason always loved as a child. The whole thing is costing us nearly $15,000, but our boy deserves the best." $15,000. I thought about my own college graduation, where they had taken me to Applebee's and split a $20 appetizer plate. I thought about my wedding, where their $50 contribution hadn't even covered the cost of my bouquet. I thought about all the medical bills I had been struggling to pay on my entry-level salary, while they were apparently sitting on enough money to throw extravagant parties. "Regional manager of the Pacific Northwest." My mother repeated her voice, practically singing with pride. "He'll be overseeing construction projects from Portland to Seattle. The salary is $85,000 a year to start, plus bonuses and a company car. We're so proud we could burst." $85,000. I was making $32,000 a year at my current job, barely enough to cover rent and groceries, let alone the mounting medical bills from my frequent emergency room visits. The position that should have been mine was worth more than twice what I was earning, and it came with benefits that could have covered the very medical care I desperately needed. "Oh, and the best part," my mother continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, but still speaking loud enough for me to hear every word, "David Henderson is going to announce that Jason will inherit the entire company when he retires. The whole business empire, worth millions of dollars, will go to our son." I felt like I was drowning, and not just because of the fluid in my lungs. The family construction business that bore my last name, that I had assumed would someday include me, was being handed entirely to Jason. Everything my grandfather had built, everything my father had expanded, would skip over me completely, as if I had never existed. Through my mother's conversation, I learned that Jason's promotion had been planned for months. They had been coordinating with the hotel, the catering company, and even a professional photographer to document this milestone moment. The same parents who claimed they couldn't leave Jason's party to be with their dying daughter had been planning this elaborate celebration with the attention to detail usually reserved for weddings. "We invited everyone from the company, plus all of Jason's friends from college," my mother said. "Even some of David's business associates will be there. This isn't just a party, Martha. It's an announcement to the whole community that the Henderson name is going to continue strong with the next generation." The Henderson name. My name too, supposedly, though clearly not in any way that mattered to my family. As my mother finally ended her phone call and walked back toward my room, I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. I couldn't bear to look at her face, knowing what I now knew about how little I meant to this family. The monitors around my bed continued their electronic symphony, the only sound in the room that seemed to acknowledge my existence. When she briefly stopped at the foot of my bed, I heard her sigh with what sounded like impatience rather than concern. "The doctors say you're stable for now," she murmured, apparently talking to herself. We'll deal with all this tomorrow after Jason's big night. Deal with all this, as if my life-threatening medical crisis was an inconvenience to be managed around their social calendar. What happened next shattered any remaining hope I had that my parents would choose me even when faced with the reality that their daughter might be dying. Patricia had become my lifeline, and as my condition continued to deteriorate throughout the afternoon, she made increasingly desperate attempts to reach my family on my behalf. The first call went straight to voicemail. Patricia left a detailed message explaining that my oxygen levels were dropping and that Dr. Martinez needed to discuss immediate surgical options with my family. She emphasized the urgency using words like critical and emergency intervention and time-sensitive decisions. 2 hours passed with no response. The second call caught my mother between hair and makeup appointments for the party. I could hear my mother's voice through Patricia's phone, sharp and impatient. "We already told you people we can't come tonight." My mother said, her tone suggesting she was annoyed at being bothered. "We have a very important family celebration that we've been planning for months. Aleida will just have to understand that the world doesn't revolve around her medical drama." Patricia's professionalism wavered for just a moment. "Ma'am, your daughter's condition has worsened significantly since this morning. The doctors need your consent for emergency procedures, and she's asking for her family." "Look, I'm sure you're doing your best, but Aleida has always been prone to exaggerating her symptoms for attention." My mother replied dismissively, "She'll be fine overnight. We'll visit her tomorrow after the party." Patricia tried again. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand that your daughter may not survive the night without surgical intervention. This is not about attention. This is about life and death." There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought maybe my mother was finally grasping the severity of the situation. Then she spoke again, and her words destroyed any last fragment of hope I had been clinging to. "Nurse, I appreciate that you're trying to do your job, but frankly, if Aleida is as sick as you're claiming, then there's probably nothing we could do anyway just by sitting in a hospital room. Our presence isn't going to cure her, but our absence would definitely ruin Jason's special night. We'll deal with whatever aftermath there is tomorrow." Patricia ended the call and stared at her phone in what appeared to be genuine shock. In all her years as a healthcare worker, she had apparently never encountered parents who would openly choose a party over their child's life. An hour later, when my blood pressure started dropping to dangerous levels, Patricia convinced Dr. Martinez to make a direct call to my parents. He identified himself as the attending physician and explained in clear clinical terms that I needed immediate surgery to repair a ruptured blood vessel in my brain, and that without the procedure, I had a very high chance of dying during the night. My father answered this time, and his response was somehow even worse than my mother's. "Well, look, doctor, I understand you're trying to do your job, but we need to be practical here." My father said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used in business meetings. "We're not medical professionals. We can't help with surgery or treatment decisions. Our son is receiving a major promotion tonight that represents years of hard work and planning. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for our family's legacy." Dr. Martinez tried to explain the concept of informed consent and family support during medical crises, but my father cut him off. "Doctor, if my daughter is really as critical as you say, then you should be focusing on treating her instead of calling us repeatedly. We have commitments tonight that affect multiple generations of our family business. We can't abandon dozens of important guests and business associates because Aleida is having another one of her episodes." Another one of her episodes, as if a life-threatening brain hemorrhage was comparable to a teenage tantrum. Dr. Martinez's voice became stern. "Mr. Henderson, this is not an episode. Your daughter has a ruptured arteriovenous malformation in her brain. Without immediate surgical intervention, she will likely die tonight. This is not a drill, and this is not an exaggeration." My father's response revealed the full depth of his callousness. Then you'd better get to work, hadn't you? We've told you we can't be there tonight. Handle it. The line went dead. Patricia made 2 more attempts to reach them over the next few hours as my condition continued to worsen. The first call went straight to voicemail again. The second time, she reached my mother, who sounded like she was already at the party based on the background noise of music and laughter. I thought I made myself clear. My mother said her words slightly slurred, suggesting she had been drinking. "We are not available tonight. Stop calling." "Ma'am, your daughter is being prepared for emergency brain surgery right now, Patricia," said her voice becoming more forceful. "She's asking for her parents. She's scared and alone, and she may not survive the procedure." "Well then, I guess you'd better take good care of her, hadn't you?" my mother replied. "We'll send flowers tomorrow if things don't go well." That's when I heard the most devastating thing of all. In the background of my mother's call, I could hear my father's voice leading a toast. "To Jason Henderson." My father's voice boomed proudly through the phone speaker, "the future of Henderson Construction and the pride of our family. Tonight, we celebrate not just his promotion, but the continuation of our family legacy through a son who has never disappointed us." Never disappointed them. Unlike his sister, the implication was clear. After Patricia ended that final call, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Honey, I'm so sorry. I've been a nurse for 15 years and I've never seen anything like this." That's when I made a decision that would change everything. As Patricia checked my IV lines and prepared me for surgery, I asked her to help me with one final task. "Patricia," I whispered, my voice weak but determined, "I need you to help me write a letter." She looked confused but nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. What kind of letter?" "The kind that's going to make them understand exactly what they've lost," I said, my voice growing stronger despite the medication flowing through my system. "And I need you to promise me something else." "Anything," she said without hesitation. "If I don't survive this surgery, I need you to make sure they know that they chose Jason's party over saying goodbye to their daughter. And if I do survive..." I paused, feeling a surge of determination I hadn't felt in years. "I need you to help me disappear." Patricia stared at me for a long moment, and I could see something shifting in her expression. It wasn't just sympathy anymore. It was resolve. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I began dictating a letter that would either be my final words to the family who had abandoned me or the first step in reclaiming a life they had nearly destroyed through their neglect. The operating room was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices as the medical team prepared to save my life. Dr. Martinez had assembled the best neurosurgical team available, and as they administered the anesthesia, I felt myself slipping away from the chaos of my family's betrayal into a strange, peaceful darkness. But then something extraordinary happened that I never could have imagined. I found myself standing in a beautiful garden that seemed to shimmer with golden light. The air was warm and filled with the scent of roses and lavender, and for the first time in months, I felt no pain. My breathing was clear and easy. My body felt strong and healthy, and there was a sense of profound peace surrounding me, like a warm embrace. That's when I saw her. My grandmother, Margaret, who had died when I was 15, was sitting on a white wooden bench beneath an enormous oak tree. She looked exactly as I remembered her, with her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and her gentle blue eyes sparkling with the same love and wisdom that had made her my favorite person in the world during my childhood. "Aleida, my precious girl," she said, rising from the bench and opening her arms to me. "Come here, sweetheart." I ran to her like the child I had once been, and when she hugged me, I felt a completeness that I had never experienced with my adoptive parents. Her embrace was everything a grandmother's hug should be: unconditional love acceptance. and the kind of deep understanding that comes from truly knowing someone's heart. Grandma Margaret, I whispered, tears of joy streaming down my face. I've missed you so much. I'm so tired of fighting. I don't think I can do this anymore. She held me at arm's length and looked into my eyes with the same expression she used to have when I was young and needed her guidance. Oh, my darling girl, you are so much stronger than you know. But there are some things you need to understand before you can find your way forward. As we sat together on the bench, Grandma Margaret began telling me a story that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Aleida, honey, you weren't born a Henderson, she said gently, taking my hands in hers. Your biological parents were Robert and Catherine Walsh, two of the most wonderful people I ever had the privilege of knowing. They died in a car accident when you were just 3 years old. The words seemed to float around me without fully sinking in at first. What do you mean David and Linda Henderson are my parents? No, sweetheart. David and Linda adopted you after your biological parents' death, but they never told you the truth. Your real parents were my neighbors, and when the accident happened, I was the one who recommended that the Hendersons adopt you because I thought they would give you a loving home. My mind reeled as she continued. Your biological father, Robert, was a brilliant engineer who had invested in technology companies in the early 1990s. Your mother, Catherine, was a teacher who came from a family with significant real estate holdings. Together, they had built up a considerable estate for your future. But if they had money, why have I been struggling financially my entire adult life? I asked, confusion mixing with a growing sense of dread. Grandma Margaret's expression grew sad and angry because, my dear, your biological parents established a trust fund specifically for your care, education, and medical needs. That trust was supposed to be managed by your adoptive parents until you turned 21, and then the remaining funds were to be turned over to you completely. The implications of what she was telling me began to sink in. How much money are we talking about? When your parents died, the trust was worth approximately $400,000. With proper investment and management over the past 25 years, it should be worth well over $1 million by now, she said. Every penny of that money was meant to ensure that you receive the best possible care and opportunities. I felt like I was falling even though I was sitting safely on the bench. But I've been struggling to pay for college, for medical bills, for everything. I've been working minimum wage jobs and taking out loans while Jason got everything handed to him. That's because David and Linda have been using your inheritance to fund Jason's lifestyle, Grandma Margaret said, her voice carrying a sadness that spoke of deep disappointment. The money that should have paid for your medical care, your education, your wedding, and your future has been spent on Jason's sports equipment, his college tuition, his car, his down payment on a house, and now his position in the family company. The betrayal was so profound that I felt physically sick even in this peaceful place. They stole my inheritance. My own adoptive parents have been stealing from me for my entire life. Yes, darling, and there's more. Your biological parents also left detailed medical records documenting the genetic condition that runs in both sides of your biological family. The hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia that nearly killed you tonight was well documented in your original medical files. David and Linda knew about your genetic predisposition, but they chose to ignore it because treating your condition would have been expensive and time-consuming. I understood now why my symptoms had been dismissed for so many years. It wasn't just neglect or favoritism. It was calculated medical neglect designed to avoid spending money on my care so that more funds would be available for Jason's pursuits. They let me get sicker and sicker because treating me would have cost money they wanted to spend on Jason. I said, the full horror of the situation becoming clear. I'm so sorry, my precious girl. I recommended them as adoptive parents because I thought they would love and care for you as their own child. I never imagined they would see you as a source of funding for their biological son's future. Grandma Margaret stood and walked to a wooden chest that I hadn't noticed before sitting beneath the oak tree. She opened it and pulled out several manila envelopes. Your biological parents left you letters to be opened on important birthdays and milestones, she said, handing me the envelopes. They also left video recordings explaining your family medical history and their hopes for your future. David and Linda were supposed to give these to you starting on your 18th birthday, but they hid them away and never told you they existed. I held the envelopes with trembling hands, seeing my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar. There were letters marked for my 13th birthday, my 16th birthday, my 18th birthday, my college graduation, my wedding day, and several others. There's also this, Grandma Margaret said, pulling out a small wooden box. This was your mother's jewelry, including her engagement ring, and a necklace that belonged to your great-grandmother Walsh. These were specifically meant to be given to you on your wedding day. I thought about my modest wedding to David, where I had worn a simple dress from a department store and carried daisies from the grocery store because we couldn't afford anything more elaborate. Meanwhile, my inheritance money had probably paid for the elaborate floral arrangements at Jason's wedding. "Why are you telling me all of this now?" I asked. "Am I dying? Is that why I can see you?" Grandma Margaret smiled and took my face in her hands. "You're at a crossroads, my darling. Your body is fighting for life on that operating table, but more importantly, your spirit is fighting for justice. You have a choice to make." "What kind of choice?" "You can let go and come with me to a place where there's no more pain or betrayal or disappointment," she said. "Or you can go back and fight for the life that was stolen from you. But if you choose to go back, you need to know that it won't be easy. Confronting the truth about what David and Linda have done will be painful and complicated." I looked around the peaceful garden, tempted by the idea of staying in this place where I felt truly loved and valued. But then I thought about Patricia, who had shown me more maternal care in one day than Linda Henderson had shown me in 25 years. I thought about all the other adopted children who might be suffering the same kind of abuse. I thought about the life I could build if I had access to the resources my biological parents had intended for me. "I want to go back," I said firmly. "I want to fight for what's mine, and I want to make sure this never happens to another child." Grandma Margaret beamed with pride. "That's my brave granddaughter. But remember, sweetheart, blood doesn't make family. Love, loyalty, and genuine care make family. You're going to find your real family among the people who choose to stand by you, not the people who happen to share your last name." She handed me one more thing, a small silver locket that felt warm in my palm. "This locket contains photos of your biological parents," she said. "When things get difficult in the days ahead, remember that Robert and Catherine Walsh loved you deeply and provided for your future because they believed you deserved every opportunity in life. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not worthy of that love and those opportunities." As the garden began to fade around me, Grandma Margaret's voice grew distant but remained clear. "It's not your time yet, sweetheart. You have important work to do. And Aleida, that nurse Patricia who has been taking care of you, she's going to be more important than you realize. Trust her." The last thing I saw before returning to consciousness was Grandma Margaret waving goodbye with tears of joy in her eyes, proud that her granddaughter had chosen to fight for justice rather than accept defeat. When I opened my eyes in the recovery room 8 hours later, the silver locket was clutched tightly in my hand. Waking up from surgery felt like emerging from the deepest sleep of my life, but I was immediately aware that everything had changed. The locket in my hand proved that my experience with Grandma Margaret had been real, and the knowledge she had shared with me burned like fire in my chest. But what happened next surprised me almost as much as a near-death experience itself. Patricia was sitting beside my bed, but she wasn't wearing her nurse's uniform. Instead, she was dressed in a business suit and had legal papers spread across a small table she had pulled up beside my bed. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, her voice filled with relief and something else I couldn't quite identify. "You've been unconscious for almost 12 hours. The surgery was successful, and Dr. Martinez says your prognosis is excellent with proper ongoing care." I struggled to sit up, and Patricia immediately helped me adjust my position. "Patricia, why are you dressed like that? And what are all these papers?" She looked slightly embarrassed, but determined. "Aleida, I need to tell you something that I probably should have mentioned earlier. I'm not just a nurse. I mean, I am a registered nurse, but I'm also a paralegal who's been working part-time here while finishing law school. I graduate next month, and I've already accepted a position with a firm that specializes in estate law and inheritance disputes." I stared at her in amazement. "Are you serious?" "I've been listening to your family's behavior over the past 24 hours, and everything about this situation has been raising legal red flags for me," she continued. "When you told me about your inheritance before surgery, I knew I had to help you investigate. I hope you don't mind, but I've spent the night doing some preliminary research." She handed me a folder thick with documents. "These are public records related to your adoption, your biological parents' estate, and the trust fund that was established for you. Aleida, what I found is going to make you very angry, but it's also going to give you the tools you need to fight back." With Patricia's help, I began examining the documents she had gathered. The first was a copy of my original birth certificate showing that I was born Aleida Catherine Walsh to Robert and Catherine Walsh in Portland, Oregon. Seeing my biological parents' names in official documents made their existence feel real in a way that my vision of Grandma Margaret hadn't quite achieved. The next document was the adoption paperwork filed when I was 3 years old. What shocked me was reading the detailed terms of the adoption, which included specific instructions about managing my inheritance trust, and the requirement that my adoptive parents provide me with letters and personal items from my biological parents at predetermined ages. "Look at this clause." Patricia pointed to a section highlighted in yellow. "Your adoptive parents were legally required to use trust funds only for your direct benefit, including education, medical care, and reasonable living expenses. They were also required to provide you with full disclosure about your inheritance when you turned 18. The next folder contained bank records that Patricia had obtained through her connections at the legal clinic where she had been working. The numbers were staggering. Your trust fund started with $420,000 in 1998. Patricia explained, showing me investment statements. With proper management, it's grown to approximately $1.4 million. But look at these withdrawal patterns. She showed me a spreadsheet she had created tracking major withdrawals from my account. $25,000 withdrawn in 2015. Coinciding with Jason's senior year of high school. $45,000 withdrawn in 2016 when Jason started college. $15,000 in 2019 for what the records listed as beneficiary educational expenses, which would have been during Jason's senior year of college. They've been systematically draining your inheritance for Jason's expenses, Patricia said, her voice tight with anger. And according to these medical records, they knew about your genetic condition from the very beginning. She handed me a manila envelope that contained copies of my original medical records from when I was a child. The documents clearly showed that my biological parents had documented the family history of hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia and had left specific instructions about monitoring and preventive care. Your biological father's family had a history of vascular malformations, and your biological mother's family had issues with iron deficiency anemia related to the condition, Patricia explained. These records recommend genetic testing by age 10 and regular screening for vascular abnormalities starting in adolescence. None of that was ever done. I thought about all the times I had begged my adoptive parents to take my symptoms seriously, all the times I had been dismissed as dramatic or attention-seeking. They had known exactly what was wrong with me and had chosen to ignore it because proper medical care would have been expensive. "There's more," Patricia said, pulling out another set of documents. "I contacted the bank that manages your trust fund. They've been trying to reach you directly since you turned 21, but all correspondence has been going to your adoptive parents' address. You should have received full control of your inheritance 7 years ago." The betrayal was so complete and systematic that I felt like I was learning about my life for the first time. Every struggle I had faced, every financial hardship, every health crisis could have been avoided if the people who claimed to love me had simply followed the legal requirements of my adoption. "Patricia, this is incredible, but what can we actually do about it?" I asked. "They're my legal parents. Don't they have some kind of authority over decisions they made while I was a minor?" Patricia smiled for the first time since she had started explaining everything. "That's where it gets interesting. Fiduciary duty doesn't end when you turn 18 if the mismanagement is ongoing. And more importantly, they committed fraud by continuing to access your trust fund after you reached the age of majority while concealing its existence from you." She pulled out business cards from several attorneys she had contacted during the night. "I've already spoken with 3 law firms that specialize in this type of case. 2 of them are willing to take your case on a contingency basis, meaning you won't pay any legal fees unless you win the case." "And what are the chances of winning?" "With this level of documentation, very high. We have clear evidence of financial fraud, medical neglect, and violation of fiduciary duty, plus the fact that they refused to come to the hospital when you were dying, creates a compelling narrative about their priorities and character." Patricia helped me sit up straighter and handed me a mirror so I could see myself. I looked pale and tired, but there was something different in my eyes. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had power. "There's something else you should know," Patricia said. "I graduate from law school in 3 weeks, and I've already been offered a position with Jenkins and Associates, the firm that specializes in inheritance law. If you want me to represent you in this case, I'd be honored to do it." I looked at this woman who had shown me more care and advocacy in 2 days than my adoptive family had shown me in 25 years. She had spent her own time and energy investigating my situation. She had used her professional connections to gather evidence. And now she was offering to stake her new legal career on fighting for my rights. "Why would you do all this for someone you just met?" I asked. Patricia's expression grew serious. "Because I was adopted too, Aleida, and while my adoptive parents were wonderful people who truly loved me, I've seen enough cases of adoption abuse to know how devastating it can be. No child should have to grow up believing they're worthless when they actually have people who provided for their future." She paused and looked out the window before continuing. "And honestly, watching your parents choose a party over their dying daughter made me so angry that I couldn't sleep last night. Someone needs to hold them accountable for what they've done to you." As we worked together, organizing the evidence and planning our next steps, I realized that Grandma Margaret had been right about Patricia being more important than I realized. This woman wasn't just going to help me recover from surgery. She was going to help me reclaim my entire life. "So what's our first move?" I asked. Patricia's smile was fierce and determined. "First, we're going to get you out of this hospital and somewhere safe where you can recover properly. Then we're going to make sure your adoptive parents understand that their free ride on your inheritance is over. And finally, we're going to make sure this never happens to another child." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope stirring in my chest. Not hope that my adoptive parents would finally love me the way I deserved, but hope that I could build a life based on truth, justice, and genuine care from people who chose to stand by me. Patricia and I spent the next 12 hours meticulously planning what she called our strategic disappearance. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity, We would use my adoptive parents' own abandonment against them while gathering evidence for the legal case that would change my life forever. The key is timing, Patricia explained as she helped me get dressed in clothes she had brought from her apartment. Your parents think you're either dead or close to dying. They've chosen to stay at their party instead of finding out which. We're going to use their callousness to our advantage. Dr. Martinez had agreed to discharge me into Patricia's care, understanding that my home environment was not conducive to recovery. He provided detailed instructions for my continued care and medications, along with documentation that would be crucial for our legal case. I want you to know, Aleida, that what your family did violates every principle of medical ethics and human decency that I've encountered in 20 years of practice, Dr. Martinez said as he signed my discharge papers. I'll be happy to testify on your behalf if needed. Patricia drove me to her apartment, which was a cozy 2-bedroom place near the university where she had been finishing law school. She had prepared the guest room with everything I might need during my recovery, including a computer where we could continue gathering evidence. But before we settled in, we had one crucial task to complete. Patricia drove us back to the hospital after visiting hours had ended, and we slipped into my former room using her access badge. This has to look authentic, Patricia said as we carefully arranged the scene. Your parents need to believe something terrible has happened, but they also need to understand that their choices led to this moment. We stripped the bed and removed all personal items, leaving the room looking exactly as it would if a patient had died and been removed. Then Patricia placed the letter we had crafted on the bedside table where my parents would be sure to see it. The letter was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity that we had worked on together for hours. By the time you read this, it will be too late. I needed you yesterday when the doctor said I might not survive the night, but you chose Jason's party instead. Now, I've chosen to survive without you. You missed everything while you were celebrating the son who never disappointed you. The daughter you abandoned has discovered truths that will change everything you thought you knew about your family. You'll understand soon enough what you've lost, and you'll realize that some choices can never be undone. The inheritance you've been stealing, the love you've been withholding, the medical care you've been denying, it all ends now. You chose Jason's success over my survival. Now live with that choice forever. The letter was carefully worded to make them believe I had died, while simultaneously hinting that I knew about their financial fraud. Patricia had insisted on language that would create maximum emotional impact while avoiding any direct threats or admissions that could hurt our legal case. This will eat them alive, Patricia said with satisfaction as we placed the letter prominently on the clean bedside table. They'll spend hours trying to figure out if you're dead or alive, and they'll know that their last conversation with their daughter was them choosing a party over her life. We also left behind a small pile of legal documents that Patricia had strategically selected copies of my original birth certificate, showing my biological parents' names, bank statements showing the trust fund withdrawals, and medical records documenting my genetic condition. We wanted them to understand immediately that their secrets had been exposed. When they see these documents, they'll know you've discovered everything, Patricia explained. They'll realize that their financial fraud has been uncovered and that they're facing serious legal consequences. The uncertainty about whether you're alive or dead will make them panic and possibly do things that will help our case. We finished staging the room and left the hospital around midnight. Patricia suggested we stop at a diner for coffee so we could be awake when my parents inevitably showed up at the hospital the following morning. I want to see their reaction when they find the empty room, I said. I need to know that they finally understand what they've done. Patricia parked her car in the hospital parking lot where we could observe the main entrance. She had brought binoculars and a camera with a telephoto lens, explaining that documenting their reaction might be useful for our legal case. My adoptive parents arrived at the hospital at 9:30 the next morning. and even from a distance, I could see that they looked terrible. My mother was wearing the same dress from the party the night before, and both of them appeared to have been drinking heavily. My father was unsteady on his feet, and my mother kept pressing tissues to her eyes. "They look like they've been up all night," Patricia observed. "Good. They should have been suffering while you were fighting for your life." We watched as they hurried through the hospital's main entrance, moving with the kind of urgent panic that they should have shown 2 days earlier when I was actually dying. Through the hospital's large windows, we could see them talking animatedly with staff at the information desk. "They're probably trying to find out which room you're in now," Patricia said. "The staff will direct them to your old room since that's the last information they have on file." 20 minutes later, we saw them emerge from the hospital, looking completely devastated. My mother was crying hysterically, and my father appeared to be in shock. They stood outside the main entrance for several minutes, apparently too distraught to even walk to their car. Patricia took photos of their obvious distress, explaining that their emotional state would support our case, that they understood the severity of their actions. "Look at them," she said with disgust. "Now they're upset. Now they're crying. Where were these emotions when you actually needed them?" We watched as my father made several phone calls, presumably trying to reach funeral homes or the hospital administration to find out what had happened to my body. My mother sat on a bench outside the hospital, sobbing into her hands while my father paced back and forth. They're realizing that their last words to their daughter were about how a party was more important than her life, Patricia said. That's going to haunt them forever, whether they deserve forgiveness or not. After about an hour, we saw Jason arrive at the hospital, still wearing his suit from the party the night before. The three of them had what appeared to be an intense conversation outside the hospital entrance, with lots of gesturing and emotional reactions. Jason's probably just finding out that his sister is supposedly dead and that his parents chose his party over saying goodbye to her, I said, watching my brother's shocked reaction to whatever my parents were telling him. Through the binoculars, I could see Jason reading the letter we had left behind, and his reaction was different from my parents'. While they looked guilty and panicked, Jason looked genuinely devastated. He appeared to be arguing with them, pointing back toward the hospital and gesturing angrily. "It looks like Jason is upset with your parents about their choice," Patricia observed. "That could be useful for our case if he's willing to testify about their behavior." We continued watching for another hour as various family members and friends arrived at the hospital, apparently summoned by frantic phone calls from my parents. Word was spreading through their social circle that something terrible had happened to me, and the people who had been celebrating Jason's promotion the night before were now faced with the reality that their celebration had prevented them from saying goodbye to a dying family member. "Oh, this is perfect," Patricia said as we documented the growing crowd of guilty-looking party guests. "Everyone who attended last night's celebration now knows that they were partying while you were dying alone. The social consequences are going to be severe." As we finally drove away from the hospital, I felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I was satisfied that my adoptive parents were finally experiencing consequences for their choices, but I was sad that it had taken a staged death scenario to make them realize how badly they had failed as parents. "How do you feel?" Patricia asked as we headed back to her apartment. "Free," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. For the first time in my life, I feel completely free from their expectations and disappointment. They chose Jason over me for the last time. Patricia smiled. "Good, because now the real work begins. We're going to make sure they face legal consequences for what they've done, and we're going to make sure you get the life your biological parents intended for you." As we settled into Patricia's apartment to begin planning the next phase of our campaign for justice, I realized that my adoptive parents' abandonment had actually been a gift. It had freed me from any remaining obligation to protect their feelings or maintain family loyalty. Now I could fight for what was rightfully mine without guilt or hesitation. The empty hospital room had been a perfect metaphor for their parenting absent, when it mattered most, leaving behind only pain and regret. The aftermath of my disappearance created exactly the kind of chaos Patricia and I had hoped for, but it also revealed the full extent of my adoptive parents' deception in ways we hadn't anticipated. While they frantically searched for my body, believing I had died alone because of their neglect, their panicked actions began exposing decades of carefully hidden fraud. From Patricia's apartment, we monitored their increasingly desperate attempts to find me through a combination of social media surveillance and carefully placed phone calls. Patricia had contacts at several funeral homes and crematoriums who agreed to call us if the Hendersons made inquiries about my body. The first sign that their panic was leading to mistakes came when Patricia's phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. It was her friend Maria who worked at Henderson Construction's accounting office. "Hey, Patricia, the strangest thing just happened," Maria said, her voice filled with confusion. "Mr. Henderson just came into the office demanding immediate access to all financial records related to something called the Walsh Trust Fund. He was acting really weird, like panicked and angry at the same time. He was yelling at our accountant about needing documentation for legitimate expenses and asking about liability protection. Do you know anything about this?" Patricia put the phone on speaker so I could hear. "Did he say anything else about this trust fund?" He kept talking about how they had proper authority to make decisions about the money, but he also seemed really worried about whether they had adequate documentation for their withdrawals. Our accountant told him she'd need more information about what specific records he needed, and he just lost it. He started screaming about family emergencies and legal deadlines. After Patricia ended the call, we looked at each other with growing excitement. "He's panicking about the financial fraud," Patricia said. "He knows you discovered the trust fund, and he's trying to cover his tracks." But that was just the beginning. Over the next few hours, we received reports that painted a picture of two people whose carefully constructed lies were unraveling in real time. My adoptive mother had apparently spent the afternoon calling every funeral home, crematorium, and morgue in a 3-county area demanding information about my body. When staff members told her they had no record of my death, she became increasingly hysterical, insisting that the hospital must have made some kind of mistake. She called Peaceful Valley Crematorium 4 times in 1 hour, reported Patricia's contact there. She kept saying things like, "My daughter died because we weren't there," and "we chose a party over our dying child." She seemed more concerned with confessing her guilt than actually finding information. The most revealing call came from Patricia's friend Jennifer, who worked at the bank that managed my trust fund. "Patricia, I had to call you about this. A man claiming to be David Henderson came in around 3 o'clock, demanding immediate access to account records for someone named Aleida Henderson Walsh. He had some kind of power of attorney document, but when we pulled up the account, we found some major red flags." "What kind of red flags?" Patricia asked. "Well, first of all, the account shows that the beneficiary should have received full control on her 21st birthday, which was 7 years ago. But this man has been making withdrawals as recently as last month. When we told him the account was flagged for investigation due to a complaint filed by the beneficiary, he went completely white." Jennifer continued, "He kept asking if we had been in contact with his daughter, and when we told him we couldn't discuss communications with the account holder, he started demanding to know if she was still alive to file complaints. That's when we knew something was seriously wrong." This was the confirmation we needed that my adoptive father understood the legal jeopardy he was facing. The bank had apparently been trying to contact me for years about assuming control of my inheritance, but all mail had been going to my adoptive parents' address where they had been intercepting and hiding my correspondence. "There's more," Jennifer said. "When we reviewed the account activity, we found withdrawal patterns that clearly violate the terms of the trust. Over $200,000 have been withdrawn for expenses that have nothing to do with the beneficiary's welfare. We're talking about luxury car payments, house down payments, and private school tuition for someone other than the account holder. Patricia was taking careful notes as Jennifer detailed the extent of the financial fraud. The trust specifically states that funds can only be used for the beneficiary's education, medical care, and reasonable living expenses. These withdrawals include things like wedding expenses, vacation costs, and business investments that clearly benefited other family members. As the afternoon progressed, we received more reports of my adoptive parents' increasingly erratic behavior. They had apparently driven to every hospital in the region, demanding to speak with administrators about their missing daughter's body. Hospital staff were concerned enough about their mental state to suggest grief counseling. But the most significant development came when Patricia received a call from Jason himself. Patricia had given Jason her contact information months earlier when they had met at a community event, and he apparently remembered that she worked at the hospital. Patricia, I hope you remember me. I'm Jason Henderson, Aleida's brother. He said, his voice shaky with emotion. I'm trying to find information about what happened to my sister. My parents are telling me she died alone at the hospital, but no one seems to know what happened to her body. Patricia looked at me questioningly, and I nodded for her to continue the conversation. We needed to understand Jason's role in all of this. I remember you, Jason. I'm sorry for your loss, Patricia said carefully. This must be very difficult for your family. That's just it, Jason said, his voice cracking. I don't think my parents are telling me the truth about everything. They keep talking about legal problems and something about a trust fund that Aleida supposedly knew about. They're acting like they're in trouble for something. Patricia and I exchanged glances. Jason apparently didn't know about the inheritance fraud, which meant he might be an unwitting beneficiary rather than a co-conspirator. I found some documents in Aleida's hospital room, Jason continued. There were papers about her adoption and something called the Walsh Trust Fund. Patricia, I had no idea Aleida was adopted. My parents never told me that, and these bank statements show huge amounts of money that I've never heard about. This was a crucial revelation. If Jason hadn't known about my adoption or the trust fund, it meant my adoptive parents had been lying to him as well. It also meant he might be willing to cooperate with our legal case if he understood what had really been happening. Jason, what exactly did your parents tell you about why they didn't come to the hospital when Aleida was dying? Patricia asked. There was a long pause before Jason answered, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with shame and anger. They told me that the doctors were being dramatic and that Aleida was just having another one of her episodes. They said the party was too important for the whole family's future to cancel, and that we could deal with Aleida's medical issues the next day. And now that you know she died alone while you were celebrating your promotion, how do you feel about that decision? Patricia pressed. Jason's voice broke completely. I feel like a monster. I should have left the party and gone to the hospital myself. I should have questioned their decision. Aleida was always getting sick, but I never realized it might be something serious. I just accepted my parents' explanation that she was being dramatic. This conversation revealed that Jason had been manipulated by our adoptive parents just as much as I had been, albeit in a different way. They had convinced him that my medical issues weren't serious while simultaneously using my inheritance money to fund his lifestyle. He was both a beneficiary and a victim of their fraud. Jason, I think there are some things about your family's finances that you need to understand, Patricia said carefully. The documents you found in Aleida's room are just the beginning. Your parents have been accessing money that legally belonged to your sister, and they've been using it to pay for expenses related to your education and lifestyle. The silence on the phone lasted so long that we thought the call had been disconnected. Finally, Jason spoke in a whisper. You're saying they stole money from Aleida to pay for my college and my car and everything else. I'm saying you need to look very carefully at those documents and ask yourself where your parents got the money for all the things they've given you over the years. Patricia replied, Your father owns a small construction company. Your mother doesn't work. How did they afford $40,000 a year for your college tuition, plus a new car, plus a down payment on your house? Another long silence. Then Jason said something that would prove crucial for our case. Oh God, they used her inheritance money for everything, didn't they? My whole life has been funded by money that was supposed to take care of my sick sister. Patricia looked at me with raised eyebrows. Having Jason understand and acknowledge the fraud would be incredibly valuable for our legal case. Jason, I can't provide legal advice, but I think you need to speak with an attorney about your family's situation, Patricia said. And you might want to consider what kind of relationship you want to have with parents who would steal from their adopted daughter's medical fund to pay for their biological son's lifestyle. After the call ended, Patricia and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. We had expected my adoptive parents to panic about their financial fraud being exposed, but we hadn't anticipated that Jason would be willing to acknowledge his unwitting participation in their scheme. This changes everything, Patricia said finally. If Jason is willing to testify about what he's learned and acknowledge that his lifestyle was funded by your inheritance, we have an incredibly strong case. The rest of the evening brought more evidence of my adoptive parents' growing desperation. They had contacted a criminal defense attorney, apparently realizing that their financial fraud could result in serious legal consequences. They had also reached out to several financial advisors trying to understand their liability for mismanaging my trust fund. They're starting to understand that this isn't just about losing a daughter, Patricia observed as we reviewed the day's developments. They're realizing that they could face criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and financial ruin. As we prepared for bed, I reflected on how different this day had been from what I had expected. Instead of grieving my death, my adoptive parents were scrambling to cover up decades of fraud and abuse. Instead of mourning their lost daughter, they were consulting lawyers and accountants about their legal exposure. Do you think they actually feel guilty about choosing the party over being with me when I was dying? I asked Patricia. She considered the question carefully before answering. I think they feel guilty about getting caught, she said, but I don't think they truly understand the emotional damage they've done to you over the years. They're more concerned about legal consequences than they are about losing your love and respect. That night, as I lay in Patricia's guest room, I realized that my adoptive parents' panic had accomplished something I had never been able to achieve in 25 years of trying to earn their love. For the first time in my life, I had their complete attention, and they understood that their choices had serious consequences. Tomorrow, Patricia and I would begin the process of making sure those consequences were permanent. After 3 days of watching my adoptive parents scramble to contain their legal exposure while publicly grieving their supposedly dead daughter, Patricia and I decided it was time to reveal the truth in a way that would maximize both emotional impact and legal advantage. What we had planned would forever change how our community viewed the Henderson family. So, social media is going to be our most powerful weapon, Patricia explained as we set up her laptop and camera equipment. Your story has everything people care about: medical neglect, family betrayal, inheritance, fraud, and a daughter who was literally abandoned while dying. This is going to go viral. We spent hours crafting a post that would tell my story with devastating effectiveness. Patricia's legal training helped us avoid any statements that could hurt our upcoming lawsuit, while my intimate knowledge of our family's history allowed us to include details that would resonate with people who had known us for years. The post began with a recent photo of me in the hospital, connected to machines and looking genuinely close to death. Patricia had taken the picture before my surgery with the specific intention of using it for this moment. My name is Aleida Henderson, and I'm alive despite my family's best efforts to ignore me to death. I wrote, 3 days ago, while I was fighting for my life in the ICU with a brain hemorrhage, my parents made a choice that revealed everything you need to know about who they really are. I went on to describe in vivid detail exactly what had happened during my medical crisis. I included screenshots of hospital records showing my condition quotes from my conversations with Dr. Martinez about the severity of my illness and documentation of my parents' repeated refusal to come to the hospital. When the doctors told my parents that I might not survive the night, their response was, "We can't come. Your brother's party is more important. Not tomorrow, not later. More important than their daughter's life." The post included photos from Jason's promotion party that I had obtained through mutual friends' social media accounts. Images of my parents smiling and raising champagne toasts while their daughter lay dying alone created a visual contrast that was both powerful and damning. But the real bombshell came when I revealed the financial fraud that had been funding Jason's lifestyle at my expense. What my parents didn't know is that I discovered the truth about my adoption and the inheritance they've been stealing for 25 years. I was adopted after my biological parents died when I was 3, and they left a substantial trust fund specifically for my medical care and education. Instead of using that money to treat the genetic condition that nearly killed me, my adoptive parents spent it on Jason's college, his car, his house, and his promotion party. I included carefully selected bank records showing the pattern of withdrawals from my trust fund, each one corresponding to major expenses in Jason's life. The numbers were staggering enough to make people understand the scope of the fraud, but Patricia had helped me present them in a way that wouldn't compromise our legal case. While I was working minimum wage jobs to pay for medical bills related to a condition they knew I had, they were spending my inheritance money on Jason's luxury lifestyle. While I took out student loans for college, they paid for Jason's education with my trust fund. While I struggled to afford basic health care, they used my money to buy Jason a house. The post included photos of my modest apartment compared to Jason's expensive home, my used car compared to his new truck, and my simple wedding compared to his elaborate destination ceremony. The visual evidence of the disparity in our treatment was impossible to ignore. But the most devastating part isn't the money they stole, it's that they let me suffer from a treatable genetic condition for years, because providing proper medical care would have been expensive and time-consuming. They had my biological parents' medical records documenting my genetic predisposition to vascular malformations, but they chose to ignore the warning signs because treating me properly would have meant less money available for Jason's pursuits. I described specific instances of medical neglect, the nosebleeds they dismissed as attention-seeking, the fainting spells they attributed to drama, the constant fatigue they blamed on laziness. Each example was documented with medical records that supported my claims. The post concluded with a message that was both heartbreaking and empowering. I'm sharing this not for pity, but for accountability. I want everyone who attended Jason's party while I was dying to understand what they were really celebrating. I want everyone who has watched my parents favor Jason over me to understand that it wasn't preference. It was theft. And I want other adopted children to know that if your parents are accessing inheritance funds while neglecting your needs, you have rights and options. Patricia helped me include contact information for organizations that help adopted children with inheritance issues, making the post not just about my situation, but about systemic problems that affect many families. Within hours of posting, the response was explosive. The first comments came from people I had known in high school and college, expressing shock and outrage about what they had learned. I always wondered why you seemed to struggle financially while Jason had everything handed to him, wrote my former college roommate. Now I understand it was literally money that belonged to you. Local business owners who had worked with Henderson Construction began commenting about their dismay at learning how the company had been funded through inheritance fraud. Several indicated they would be reconsidering their business relationships with my adoptive father's company. But the most powerful responses came from people in our community who had witnessed my family's dysfunction over the years and had suspected something was wrong. Teachers from my high school shared memories of me being visibly ill during classes while my parents focused exclusively on Jason's athletic achievements. Neighbors recalled seeing me struggle with yard work and household responsibilities while Jason was exempt from chores. I always thought there was something off about how differently they treated their children, wrote Mrs. Thompson, who had lived next door to us for 15 years. But I never imagined it was this calculated and cruel. The post was shared hundreds of times within the first few hours, and local news outlets began reaching out for interviews. By evening, it had been shared across multiple social media platforms and was generating thousands of comments from people across the region. The story resonated with adopted children, medical patients, and anyone who had experienced family favoritism. People shared their own stories of inheritance fraud, medical neglect, and sibling favoritism, creating a massive conversation about family abuse and legal accountability. "This is exactly the kind of response we hoped for," Patricia said as we monitored the growing viral spread of my story. "Public opinion is going to be crucial when we go to court. Judges and juries are influenced by community sentiment, and your adoptive parents just became the most hated people in Springfield." The social media campaign also generated unexpected support from advocacy organizations. The National Center for Adoption Rights offered to provide additional legal resources for my case. Several inheritance law firms reached out offering pro bono services. Medical advocacy groups shared my story as an example of how genetic discrimination can occur within families. Most importantly, the viral post generated contact from other adopted children who had experienced similar abuse. Patricia and I began receiving messages from people across the country who had discovered that their adoptive parents were misusing inheritance funds or neglecting medical needs. "Your story gave me the courage to investigate my own adoption situation," wrote one woman. "I just found out that my biological parents left money for my education, that my adoptive parents spent on their biological children instead." By the end of the day, my post had been viewed over 50,000 times and shared across multiple news platforms. Local reporters were camped outside my adoptive parents' house, asking for their response to the allegations. Henderson Construction's business phone was ringing constantly, with people demanding explanations for the financial fraud. "How do you think your parents are handling this?" Patricia asked as we watched news coverage of reporters trying to get comments from my adoptive family. "They're probably realizing that their reputation in this community is destroyed forever," I said, feeling a satisfaction I had never experienced before. "Everyone they know now understands that they chose a party over their dying daughter and that they've been stealing from me for 25 years. The viral social media campaign achieved everything we had hoped for. It created public accountability for my adoptive parents' actions, generated support for our legal case, and connected me with resources and advocates I had never known existed. But most importantly, it gave me something I had been seeking my entire life: validation that the treatment I had received was unacceptable and that I deserved better. For the first time in my 28 years, I felt like my voice mattered and that my story had the power to create real change. The viral social media campaign had accomplished more than Patricia and I had ever dared to hope, but what happened next transformed my case from a local family dispute into something that legal experts would later describe as one of the most egregious examples of inheritance fraud in Oregon state history. 3 days after my story exploded across social media, Patricia received a phone call that changed everything. The caller was Sarah Brennan, a high-profile attorney from Portland who specialized in complex inheritance disputes, and had built her reputation on taking down corrupt guardians and trustees who exploited vulnerable beneficiaries. Patricia, I've been following the Henderson case on social media, and I need to meet with your client immediately. Sarah said, her voice carrying an urgency that suggested this wasn't a routine consultation. What I'm seeing in those bank records you posted suggests a level of systematic fraud that goes far beyond simple mismanagement. Sarah drove down from Portland that afternoon, and when she arrived at Patricia's apartment, she brought with her a team of forensic accountants and legal investigators who had been analyzing my case pro bono since my story went viral. Aleida, I want to be completely transparent with you about why I'm here, Sarah said as she spread files across Patricia's dining room table. My firm typically charges $500 an hour for inheritance fraud cases, but I'm offering to represent you completely free of charge. Do you know why? I shook my head, overwhelmed by the professional intensity she brought to the room. Because in 22 years of practice, I have never seen a case with this combination of documented fraud, medical neglect, and emotional abuse. Your adoptive parents didn't just steal money from you. They created a systematic scheme to defraud an orphan child while endangering her life through medical neglect. This case is going to set legal precedents. Sarah opened her first file and pulled out documents that made my previous discoveries look like the tip of an iceberg. My forensic accountants have been working around the clock since your story went viral, and what we've uncovered is staggering. Your trust fund isn't worth the $1.4 million that your bank indicated. It's worth significantly more. She handed me a financial analysis that showed numbers I could barely comprehend. Your biological parents invested in several technology companies in the early 1990s, including early stakes in companies that became major players in the dot-com boom. With proper management and reinvestment, your trust fund should be worth approximately $2.8 million today. The room seemed to spin around me. $2.8 million. More money than I could have imagined, certainly enough to have covered every medical expense, educational cost, and living expense I had ever needed. But here's where it gets really interesting. Sarah continued pulling out another set of documents. Your adoptive parents haven't just been making unauthorized withdrawals. They've been actively mismanaging the investments to hide the extent of their theft. They've been moving money between accounts, making poor investment choices deliberately, and even borrowing against the trust's assets to fund additional expenses. Patricia leaned forward, her legal training helping her understand the implications. You're saying they were actively trying to reduce the value of the trust to make their theft less obvious? Exactly. They've been engaging in what we call strategic depletion, deliberately reducing the trust's value so that their withdrawals would appear to represent a larger percentage of the total funds than they actually did, Sarah explained. It's an incredibly sophisticated form of fraud that suggests they had professional help in concealing their activities. Sarah's team had also uncovered something even more damaging, evidence that my adoptive parents had been in contact with the trust administrators for years, lying about my whereabouts and well-being to maintain their access to the funds. Every year, the trust administrators are required to contact you directly to provide account statements and verify that the funds are being used appropriately. Sarah said, showing me correspondence I had never seen. Your adoptive parents told them you were traveling extensively for work and had requested that all communications go through them as your representatives. The lies were breathtakingly elaborate. According to the documentation Sarah had obtained, my adoptive parents had created an entire fictional narrative about my life to maintain their control over my inheritance. They had told the trust administrators that I was working as a traveling consultant living abroad for extended periods, and had specifically requested that my parents handle all financial decisions until I returned to the United States permanently. They've been forging your signature on documents for 7 years, Sarah said, showing me papers that bore what was supposedly my signature approving various expenditures. This isn't just inheritance fraud anymore. This is identity theft forgery and conspiracy to defraud a financial institution. The criminal implications of what Sarah was describing were staggering. My adoptive parents weren't just facing civil penalties for mismanaging my inheritance. They were looking at potential federal criminal charges for mail fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. But Sarah wasn't finished with her revelations. There's something else you need to know, Aleida. Your biological parents left specific instructions about your medical care that your adoptive parents have been deliberately ignoring. She handed me a manila folder that contained medical records I had never seen before. Your biological parents documented their family history of hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia in extensive detail. They left instructions for genetic testing by age 10, annual cardiovascular screening starting at 15, and emergency protocols for managing vascular complications. The medical neglect was even more calculated than I had realized. My adoptive parents hadn't just ignored my symptoms, they had actively concealed medical information that could have saved me from years of suffering and prevented the life-threatening crisis I had just survived. Your biological parents also left funds specifically designated for medical expenses related to your genetic condition, Sarah continued. Approximately $400,000 was set aside exclusively for your healthcare needs. Your adoptive parents spent that money on Jason's college tuition and their family vacations. I felt like I was learning about my life from the perspective of a complete stranger. Every assumption I had made about my family's financial situation, every time I had been told we couldn't afford proper medical care, every sacrifice I had made to avoid burdening my adoptive parents, all of it had been based on lies designed to conceal their theft. "Why, what are our legal options?" Patricia asked, taking notes as Sarah outlined the scope of the fraud. "We're filing both civil and criminal complaints," Sarah said. "The civil case will focus on recovering all stolen funds plus punitive damages. The criminal referrals will go to both state and federal prosecutors since the fraud involved interstate wire transfers and mail fraud." Sarah explained that the strength of our case was unprecedented. "We have documented evidence of financial fraud, medical neglect, identity theft, and conspiracy. We have witnesses to their admission of choosing a party over their daughter's life. And now we have your viral social media campaign demonstrating the community impact of their actions." She also revealed that several other law firms had reached out offering assistance after seeing my story. "The legal community is outraged by what happened to you, Aleida. This case is being seen as an opportunity to establish stronger protections for adopted children and trust fund beneficiaries." But perhaps the most significant development was that Sarah's investigation had attracted the attention of state legislators who were interested in using my case to strengthen inheritance protection laws. State Senator Maria Rodriguez has been following your case, and she wants to introduce legislation that would require annual independent audits of inheritance trusts and direct communication between trust administrators and beneficiaries, Sarah said. "Your story could help prevent this from happening to other adopted children." As Sarah's team packed up their files, she made one final observation that crystallized everything I had been feeling since this nightmare began. "Aleida, what your adoptive parents did to you represents a complete betrayal of the most fundamental responsibilities of parenthood," she said. "They were supposed to protect your inheritance, safeguard your health, and prioritize your well-being. Instead, they systematically exploited you for financial gain while endangering your life through medical neglect." After Sarah and her team left, Patricia and I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what we had learned. "How do you feel?" Patricia asked finally. "Angry," I said, surprising myself with the intensity of my emotion. "I'm furious that they stole so much from me, but I'm even more angry about all the ways my life could have been different if they had just followed the law and their moral obligations." Patricia nodded. "You should be angry. What they did is unforgivable." As we prepared for the legal battle ahead, I realized that this case was about much more than recovering stolen money. It was about establishing that adopted children have the same rights as biological children, that inheritance theft is a serious crime with serious consequences, and that medical neglect in the name of financial gain is absolutely unacceptable. For the first time in my life, I had a team of legal professionals who were committed to fighting for my rights and holding my adoptive parents accountable for their actions. The war for justice was about to begin. The most unexpected development in our legal campaign came from the person I had least expected to become an ally, my brother Jason. 4 days after Sarah Brennan took my case, Jason appeared at Patricia's apartment, and the conversation that followed would prove to be crucial for both our legal strategy and my emotional healing. Patricia answered the door to find Jason standing there, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his eyes were red from crying, and he was holding a manila envelope that appeared to contain legal documents. "I need to talk to Aleida," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know she's here and I know she's alive. I have things to tell her that she needs to hear." Patricia looked at me questioningly, and after a moment of consideration, I nodded for her to let him in. I was curious about what Jason could possibly say that would matter at this point, but I also recognized that his cooperation could be valuable for our case. Jason walked into Patricia's living room and immediately broke down in tears when he saw me sitting on the couch. "Aleida, I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I didn't come to the hospital. I'm sorry I believed Mom and Dad when they said you were being dramatic. I'm sorry I never questioned why I got everything while you got nothing." I watched my brother cry with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. Jason had benefited from our parents' favoritism his entire life, and while I believed his remorse was genuine, I wasn't sure how much it actually meant in practical terms. "Jason, why are you here?" I asked directly. "What do you want?" He wiped his eyes and opened the envelope he had been carrying. "I've been doing research since I found those documents in your hospital room, and I've discovered things about our family that I think you need to know. Things that make Mom and Dad's actions even worse than what you've already exposed." The first revelation was something I had suspected but never been able to prove Jason had known about my adoption for years. "I've known you were adopted since I was 16, he confessed, his voice filled with shame. "Mom and Dad told me when they needed my cooperation to access your trust fund for my college expenses. They said that telling you about the adoption would be traumatic and unnecessary since you were already part of the family." The betrayal of this news hit me harder than I had expected. Not only had my adoptive parents lied to me about my origins, but they had included Jason in their conspiracy while excluding me from the truth about my own life. "They made me promise never to tell you," Jason continued. "They said that you were fragile and that learning about your adoption might trigger some kind of mental health crisis. I was young and stupid, and I believed them." Patricia was taking notes as Jason spoke, recognizing the legal significance of his admissions. Having testimony that my adoptive parents had deliberately concealed my adoption while using that concealment to facilitate financial fraud would strengthen our case considerably. But Jason's revelations were just beginning. "There's more, Aleida. I've been going through old family papers, and I found documents that show Mom and Dad knew about your medical condition from the very beginning. They had reports from your biological parents' doctors describing your genetic risks, but they chose to ignore them." He handed me medical records that I had never seen before, dating back to when I was first adopted. The documents clearly outlined the symptoms to watch for, the recommended testing protocols, and the potential complications if the condition went untreated. "They knew," Jason said, his voice breaking again. "They knew exactly what symptoms to look for, they knew what treatments were available, and they knew what the consequences would be if you didn't receive proper care. They chose to ignore all of it because treating your condition properly would have been expensive." The medical records Jason had found included specific recommendations that my adoptive parents seek consultations with genetic specialists, hematologists, and cardiovascular doctors. They also included information about support groups and educational resources that could have helped me understand and manage my condition. I also found this, Jason said, pulling out a letter that made my blood run cold. It was correspondence between my adoptive parents and the trust administrators from 5 years earlier discussing my supposed request to delay receiving information about my inheritance until I was more mature and settled in my career. The letter was written in my adoptive father's handwriting but signed with what was clearly a forged version of my signature. It requested that all trust communications continue to go through my adoptive parents, and that distributions from the fund continue to be managed by them for my protection and well-being. They've been actively lying to the trust administrators about your wishes and your whereabouts for years, Jason said. I found dozens of these letters, all forged with your signature, all designed to keep control of your money. Patricia examined the forged documents carefully. These are going to be crucial evidence for our criminal case, she said. Forgery and mail fraud are federal crimes with serious penalties. But the most shocking revelation came when Jason described a conversation he had overheard between our adoptive parents just 2 years earlier. I was visiting for Christmas, and I heard Mom and Dad talking in the kitchen after they thought I had gone to bed. Jason said, his voice filled with horror at the memory. Dad was complaining about your frequent doctor visits and emergency room trips, saying that your medical bills were eating into Jason's future. He paused, clearly struggling with what he was about to reveal. Mom said that maybe they should just let nature take its course with your health problems, since you were clearly not going to amount to much anyway. She said that spending your inheritance money on your medical care was throwing good money after bad. The callousness of this conversation was breathtaking. My adoptive parents had literally discussed allowing me to die from my untreated condition so that more inheritance money would be available for Jason's benefit. That's when I started to realize that something was seriously wrong with how they treated you, Jason continued, but I was too much of a coward to speak up or ask questions. I was benefiting from the money they were stealing from you, and I didn't want to jeopardize my comfortable lifestyle. Jason's honesty about his own complicity was both painful and refreshing. He wasn't trying to present himself as an innocent victim. He was acknowledging that he had chosen to remain willfully ignorant about the source of his privileges. I want to make this right, Aleida, he said, pulling out additional documents from his envelope. I've spent the last week calculating how much money I've received from your trust fund over the years, and I want to pay it all back. He handed me a spreadsheet that detailed every major expense in his life that had been funded by my inheritance, college tuition, car payments, house, down payment, wedding costs, and various other expenditures. The total was staggering, over $350,000. I've already talked to a financial advisor about liquidating my assets to repay what I owe you, Jason said. I'm going to sell my house, sell my car, and use every penny of my savings to return your money. It won't cover everything they stole, but it's a start. Patricia looked impressed by Jason's commitment to making restitution. Jason, this kind of voluntary repayment could be very helpful for our case, but you should understand that cooperating with us might mean testifying against your parents in court. Jason nodded without hesitation. I understand. I'm willing to testify about everything I know, including the forged documents, the medical neglect, and the conversations I overheard. Mom and Dad destroyed their relationship with Aleida through their greed and callousness, but I don't have to continue being part of their conspiracy. He turned to look at me directly. I know I can never undo the years of watching you suffer while I benefited from money that belonged to you. I know I can never make up for not questioning why you were always struggling while I had everything handed to me. But I want to try to do the right thing now, even if it's too late to matter. I studied my brother's face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving motives, but what I saw was genuine remorse and a determination to take responsibility for his role in my exploitation. "Why now, Jason?" I asked. "Why are you suddenly willing to give up everything and testify against the parents who gave you such a privileged life?" His answer was simple but profound, because I finally understand that my privileged life was built on my sister's suffering, and I can't live with that knowledge without trying to fix it. Jason spent the next 2 hours providing detailed information about our adoptive parents' financial activities, their discussions of my medical condition, and their strategies for maintaining control of my inheritance. His testimony would prove to be some of the most damaging evidence against them. As he prepared to leave, Jason made one final statement that would stay with me long after our legal battle was over. "Aleida, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness and I'm not asking for it," he said, "but I want you to know that learning the truth about what they did to you has made me realize that the real family bonds are the ones we choose to honor, not the ones we're born into. I choose to honor the bond I should have had with you all along." After Jason left, Patricia and I sat in contemplative silence, having my brother acknowledge the extent of our adoptive parents' fraud and commit to making restitution was more than we had hoped for, but it also raised complex questions about forgiveness and family loyalty. "How do you feel about Jason's offer to cooperate?" Patricia asked. "I feel like it's the first time in our relationship that he's treated me as his equal rather than as an inconvenience to be managed," I said. "It doesn't erase 25 years of complicity, but it's a start." Jason's decision to break with our adoptive parents and support our legal case would prove to be a turning point that transformed our family dynamics forever. For the first time in my life, I had a brother who was willing to stand up for what was right, even when it cost him everything he had been given. 2 weeks after Jason's confession and commitment to cooperate with our legal case, Sarah Brennan and I decided it was time for a direct confrontation with my adoptive parents. The setting we chose was both strategic and symbolically perfect: Henderson Construction's annual company picnic, where my adoptive father would be celebrating his business success in front of employees, clients, and community members who had just learned the truth about how his company had been funded. "Public confrontations are risky," Sarah had warned me during our planning session, "but in this case, the benefits outweigh the dangers. We want your adoptive parents to understand the full scope of their legal exposure while ensuring that their business associates understand the character of the people they've been working with." The Henderson Construction Company picnic was held every year at Riverside Park, and it was traditionally a major social event in Springfield. Local business owners, city council members, and prominent community leaders typically attended, making it the perfect venue to demonstrate how thoroughly my adoptive parents had lost their standing in the community. Patricia and I arrived at the park around 2 in the afternoon, just as the festivities were getting into full swing. Sarah had driven down from Portland specifically for this confrontation, bringing with her a briefcase full of legal documents and a photographer to document the proceedings. The scene was surreal. My adoptive parents were standing near the main pavilion greeting guests and trying to maintain their usual facade of successful community leaders. But I could see immediately that the past 2 weeks had taken a severe toll on them. My adoptive father looked haggard and stressed, constantly checking his phone and surveying the crowd nervously. My adoptive mother appeared to have been drinking heavily despite the early hour, and her attempts at socializing seemed forced and desperate. "Now, they know their world is collapsing," Sarah observed as we watched them from across the park. "Look at how their business associates are interacting with them. The body language tells the whole story." Indeed, the usual crowd of eager networking partners and friendly competitors seemed to be keeping their distance from my adoptive parents. Conversations appeared stilted and brief, and several people glanced in our direction when they spotted me approaching. Jason was there as well, standing awkwardly near the edge of the crowd and clearly uncomfortable with the celebration of a business that he now understood had been built partly on stolen inheritance money. When he saw me approaching, he nodded respectfully, but made no move to warn our adoptive parents of my presence. I had dressed carefully for this confrontation, wearing a professional business suit that projected confidence and authority. Sarah had suggested that my appearance should convey strength and success rather than victimization, and the effect was immediately noticeable as people began recognizing me and whispering among themselves. The moment my adoptive parents saw me walking toward them was electric. My adoptive father went completely pale and nearly dropped the beer bottle he was holding. My adoptive mother made a strangled sound and grabbed his arm for support. "Hello, David. Hello, Linda," I said, using their first names deliberately to signal that I no longer considered them my parents. "I hope you don't mind me crashing your party. I thought it was time we had a conversation about our family business." The silence that fell over the immediate area was absolute. Everyone within hearing distance stopped their conversations and turned to watch what was clearly going to be a dramatic confrontation. "Aleida." My adoptive father stammered, his voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine fear. We thought you were dead." I finished for him. "Yes, I'm sure you did. After all, the last time we spoke, you made it very clear that Jason's party was more important than whether your daughter survived the night." Sarah stepped forward and handed my adoptive father an official-looking envelope. "David Henderson, you are hereby served with notice of civil litigation for inheritance, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and medical negligence. You have 30 days to respond to these charges." The crowd around us had grown larger as word spread that the woman from the viral social media post was confronting her adoptive parents publicly. People were pulling out their phones to record the encounter, ensuring that this moment would be preserved and shared widely. My adoptive mother tried to speak, but her words came out slurred and defensive. "Aleida, honey, we can explain everything. There have been misunderstandings about the financial arrangements." "Misunderstandings?" I interrupted, my voice carrying clearly across the park. "Is that what you call 25 years of systematic theft from an orphaned child's inheritance fund?" I pulled out my own folder of documents and began reading from them in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "June 2015. $45,000 withdrawn from Aleida Henderson Walsh's trust fund to pay for Jason Henderson's college tuition. September 2019, $28,000 withdrawn to purchase Jason Henderson's wedding ring and honeymoon expenses. March 2023, $15,000 withdrawn to fund the down payment on Jason Henderson's house." The specificity of the financial information I was providing made it clear that this wasn't emotional hyperbole, but documented fact. Several business owners in the crowd looked genuinely shocked as they realized the extent of the fraud I was describing. "All of this money," I continued, "was supposed to be used for my medical care and education. Instead, while I was working minimum wage jobs and taking out loans to pay for basic health care, you were using my inheritance to fund a lifestyle for Jason that I could never afford for myself." My adoptive father tried to interrupt, but Sarah stepped forward with additional documents. "We also have evidence of mail fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to defraud a financial institution. Mr. Henderson, did you forge your adoptive daughter's signature on trust fund documents?" The question hung in the air like an accusation that everyone in the crowd understood. My adoptive father looked around desperately, apparently realizing that denying the charges publicly would only make things worse when the evidence was presented in court. "This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion," he said finally, his voice weak and defensive. "These are private family matters that should be handled privately." "Private family matters?" I laughed bitterly. You made our family business very public when you chose to celebrate Jason's stolen promotion while I was dying alone in the ICU. You made it public when you spent 25 years using community events like this one to present yourselves as successful parents while systematically abusing and exploiting your adopted daughter. I turned to address the crowd that had gathered around us. I want everyone here to understand exactly who you've been doing business with. These are people who stole money from an orphan child's medical fund to buy luxury cars and vacation homes. These are people who ignored documented genetic medical conditions because treating their daughter properly would have been inconvenient and expensive. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and devastating for my adoptive parents' reputation. Several longtime business associates shook their heads in disgust and walked away. Others pulled out their phones to cancel future appointments or contracts. Margaret Collins, who owned one of the largest property development firms in the region, spoke up loudly enough for everyone to hear. David, if these allegations are true, Collins Development will not be able to continue our partnership with Henderson Construction. We cannot associate our company with this kind of behavior. Similar declarations followed from other business owners, and I watched my adoptive father's professional network crumble in real time. The company picnic that was supposed to celebrate Henderson Construction's success had become a public relations disaster that would probably destroy the business entirely. But the most powerful moment of the confrontation came when I pulled out the final document Sarah had prepared for this encounter. This is a restraining order that prohibits you from making any additional withdrawals from my trust fund, I announced, handing the papers to my adoptive father. It also requires you to turn over all financial records related to my inheritance and provide a complete accounting of every penny you've stolen over the past 25 years. My adoptive mother began crying hysterically, but her tears seemed to be motivated more by embarrassment and fear than by genuine remorse. "Aleida, we love you," she sobbed. "We raised you as our own daughter. How can you destroy our family like this?" "You destroyed our family," I replied firmly, "when you decided that a party was more important than your daughter's life. You destroyed our family when you chose to steal from me instead of loving me. You destroyed our family when you let me suffer from a treatable medical condition because providing proper care would have been expensive." As Sarah and I prepared to leave, I made one final statement that I had been planning throughout this entire ordeal. To everyone who attended Jason's promotion party while I was fighting for my life in the ICU, I want you to understand what you were really celebrating. You were celebrating a promotion that was funded by money stolen from his adopted sister's medical fund. You were celebrating a man who received opportunities that should have belonged to the daughter they abandoned. The silence that followed this statement was profound and uncomfortable. Everyone at the picnic now understood that they had unknowingly participated in celebrating the fruits of inheritance, fraud, and child abuse. As we walked away from the confrontation, Sarah put her hand on my shoulder. "How do you feel?" Free," I said without hesitation. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free from any obligation to protect their feelings or maintain family loyalty." The public confrontation at the company picnic accomplished everything we had hoped for. It demonstrated the community consequences of my adoptive parents' actions. It provided additional documentation for our legal case, and it gave me the satisfaction of seeing them face immediate accountability for their choices. Most importantly, it marked the moment when I stopped being a victim of their abuse and became a survivor who was fighting back with the full power of the law and community support behind me. 6 months after the confrontation at the company picnic, our legal case reached its conclusion in a courtroom packed with community members, journalists, and other adopted children who had been following my story. The verdict was everything Sarah Brennan had predicted, and more, a complete vindication that would reshape my life and set legal precedents for protecting adopted children from inheritance fraud. Judge Margaret Chen, who had been assigned to our case, took the unusual step of reading her ruling aloud, in detail explaining that the case raised issues of such public importance that the court's reasoning should be clearly documented for future reference. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates a pattern of financial fraud, medical negligence, and emotional abuse that violates every principle of adoptive parenting. Judge Chen stated, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. The defendants systematically exploited their position as guardians to enrich themselves at the expense of a vulnerable child, while simultaneously endangering that child's life through willful medical neglect. The financial judgment was staggering. My adoptive parents were ordered to pay full restitution of $2.8 million, plus punitive damages of an additional $1.2 million. The total award of $4 million reflected not just the money they had stolen, but additional compensation for the medical expenses, pain and suffering, and lost opportunities their fraud had created. The punitive damages in this case are specifically designed to send a message that inheritance fraud against adopted children will not be tolerated, Judge Chen explained. The defendants' actions represent a betrayal of trust so profound that ordinary restitution is insufficient to address the harm they have caused. But the most emotionally significant part of the ruling came when Judge Chen addressed the discovery of letters and videos that my biological parents had left for me, materials that my adoptive parents had hidden for over 10 years. During the evidence discovery phase of this case, investigators found a safety deposit box containing personal communications from the plaintiff's biological parents to their daughter, Judge Chen said. These materials were specifically intended to be given to the plaintiff on her 18th birthday and subsequent milestones. The defendant's decision to withhold these materials represents an additional form of emotional abuse that deprived the plaintiff of her connection to her biological heritage. Sarah had arranged for the safety deposit box to be opened in my presence just 2 weeks before the trial, and the experience had been overwhelming. Inside were letters from my biological parents for every major milestone: my 13th birthday, high school graduation, college graduation, wedding day, and the birth of future children they hoped I would have. Reading my biological mother Catherine's letter intended for my 18th birthday had brought me to tears. "My darling Aleida," she had written in elegant handwriting, "if you are reading this, it means that Robert and I are no longer with you to celebrate this important milestone. But we want you to know that we have been watching over you with love every day since you were born." The letter went on to describe their hopes for my future, their pride in the young woman they knew I would become, and their confidence that I would find happiness and success despite the tragedy of losing them so young. "Remember, sweetheart, that you carry the best of both our families in your heart. You are strong, intelligent, and capable of achieving anything you set your mind to." My biological father, Robert, had left videos for each birthday, recorded when I was just 2 years old. Watching him speak directly to me about his hopes for my future, seeing his face and hearing his voice had given me a connection to my origins that I had never imagined possible. "Ah, happy 13th birthday, little princess," he said in one video, his face bright with love and anticipation. "By now you're probably thinking about high school and wondering what kind of person you want to become. I want you to know that your mother and I believe you can become anything you dream of being." Perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was a detailed medical file my biological parents had compiled, documenting not just my genetic risks, but also specific preventive measures and treatment protocols. The information was so comprehensive that if my adoptive parents had followed their recommendations, I would never have experienced the medical crisis that nearly killed me. "Your biological parents left medical information that could have prevented the health emergency that brought this case to light," Judge Chen noted in her ruling. The defendant's decision to ignore this medical guidance represents a level of negligence that borders on criminal behavior. The criminal charges had been handled separately, and my adoptive parents had already pleaded guilty to mail fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges. They were facing 5 years in federal prison and would be required to register as financial criminals, permanently barring them from serving as trustees, guardians, or financial representatives for any other children. But the aspect of our victory that meant the most to me personally was Judge Chen's finding about the emotional and psychological impact of my adoptive parents' behavior. The evidence demonstrates that the defendants created a family environment designed to systematically diminish the plaintiff's self-worth while elevating their biological son, Judge Chen stated. This pattern of emotional abuse was not accidental or inadvertent, but rather a calculated strategy to justify their theft of the plaintiff's inheritance. The judge's recognition that my lifelong struggle with feeling worthless and undeserving had been deliberately created by my adoptive parents validated feelings I had carried for 28 years. I hadn't been too sensitive or dramatic. I had been responding normally to abnormal treatment. After the formal ruling, Sarah arranged for a press conference where I could address the media attention my case had generated. Reporters from across the region were present, along with representatives from adoption advocacy organizations and inheritance protection groups. This case was never just about money, I told the assembled journalists. It was about establishing that adopted children have the same rights as biological children, and that adoptive parents have the same responsibilities as biological parents. No child should have to grow up feeling worthless while their inheritance is stolen to benefit their siblings. The press conference also announced the launch of the Margaret Henderson Foundation, the nonprofit organization I was establishing, with part of my settlement money to help other adopted children facing similar abuse. We've already heard from over 200 adopted children across the country who suspect their inheritances are being misused, I announced. The Margaret Henderson Foundation will provide legal resources, investigative support, and emotional counseling to help these children protect their rights and recover stolen assets. Patricia, who had graduated from law school and been hired as the foundation's lead attorney, spoke about the legal reforms we were advocating for. Aleida's case has exposed systemic weaknesses in how inheritance trusts are monitored and protected. We're working with legislators in 12 states to strengthen oversight requirements and ensure that adopted children receive direct communication about their inheritances. The media response to our victory was overwhelmingly positive, with editorial writers and legal experts praising the court's strong stance against inheritance fraud. Several law schools indicated they would be using our case as a teaching example of how adoptive families can exploit vulnerable children. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other adopted children who had been inspired by my story to investigate their own situations. In the weeks following our court victory, the foundation received dozens of calls from people who had discovered similar patterns of financial abuse in their adoptive families. Your courage to fight back gave me the strength to ask questions about my own inheritance, wrote one woman from California. I just discovered that my adoptive parents have been accessing a trust fund that was supposed to pay for my medical school. I'm 35 years old and just learning that I was supposed to be a doctor. As I stood in the courthouse steps after our victory, surrounded by legal advocates, journalists, and supporters, I realized that my near-death experience had been the beginning of a journey that led not just to personal justice, but to a movement that would protect other vulnerable children. The empty hospital bed that had terrified my adoptive parents 6 months earlier had become the foundation for a new life built on truth, justice, and genuine relationships with people who chose to stand by me rather than exploit me. For the first time in my 28 years, I felt truly free to become the person my biological parents had hoped I would be: strong, intelligent, and capable of achieving anything I set my mind to accomplish. 1 year after our courtroom victory, I stood in the newly renovated office space that housed the Margaret Henderson Foundation, looking out at a team of dedicated attorneys, social workers, and advocates who had joined our mission to protect adopted children from inheritance fraud. What had started as my personal fight for justice had grown into a national movement that was changing laws and saving lives. The foundation's success exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. We had handled over 400 cases in our first year, recovering more than $12 million in stolen inheritance funds for adopted children across the United States. Our work had led to criminal charges against 67 adoptive parents and guardians and had resulted in new legislation in 18 states strengthening protections for inheritance trusts. Patricia had become our chief legal counsel and had assembled a team of attorneys who specialized in inheritance fraud, adoption law, and family court advocacy. Her legal clinic provided free services to adopted children who suspected financial abuse, and her research had helped establish the legal frameworks that other attorneys were using to pursue similar cases. What we've discovered is that Aleida's case wasn't unusual in its fundamental structure. Patricia explained during a presentation to the National Conference of Adoption Advocates. Inheritance fraud against adopted children is disturbingly common, but most victims never realize what's happening to them because they trust their adoptive parents and don't have access to financial information. Our foundation had developed a systematic approach to identifying and addressing inheritance fraud. We created educational materials that helped adopted children understand their rights. We provided investigative services to uncover financial irregularities, and we offered legal representation to pursue recovery of stolen assets. But perhaps our most important innovation was the establishment of direct communication protocols between trust administrators and beneficiaries. Working with financial institutions across the country, we had helped create systems that ensured adopted children received independent information about their inheritances starting at age 16, regardless of their guardian's wishes. The key insight from Aleida's case is that inheritance fraud thrives in secrecy, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the child psychologist we had hired to develop our counseling programs. When adopted children don't know they have inheritances, they can't protect themselves from exploitation. My own role in the foundation had evolved from client to executive director, and I found myself traveling across the country to speak at conferences, testify before legislative committees, and meet with other survivors of inheritance fraud. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply fulfilling, giving purpose to the suffering I had experienced. During one particularly memorable trip to Texas, I met with Maria Santos, a 19-year-old college student who had discovered that her adoptive parents had been using her inheritance to fund their biological children's educations while forcing her to work 2 jobs to pay for community college. I always wondered why my adoptive siblings got to go to private schools and expensive summer camps while I was told we couldn't afford anything extra for me, Maria told me during our consultation. Now I understand that they could afford it. They just chose to spend my money on their biological children instead. Maria's case was typical of many we encountered. Her biological parents had died in a workplace accident when she was 4, leaving a substantial workers' compensation settlement in trust for her care. Her adoptive parents had systematically diverted those funds to provide advantages for their biological children, while forcing Maria to believe she was a financial burden on the family. The psychological impact of this kind of fraud is often more devastating than the financial theft, Dr. Mitchell explained. These children grow up believing they're worthless and undeserving when the reality is that they're being systematically exploited by the people who are supposed to protect them. Working with Mariah reminded me of my own journey from victim to survivor to advocate. With the foundation's legal support, she was able to recover over $300,000 in stolen inheritance money and pursue her dream of becoming a nurse. More importantly, she gained the confidence and self-worth that had been stolen from her, along with her inheritance. Before I contacted the foundation, I thought I was lucky that my adoptive parents had chosen me despite my being such a burden, Maria told me months later. Now I understand that I wasn't chosen. I was exploited, and that understanding has freed me to build relationships based on genuine love rather than obligation. The foundation's work also attracted the attention of adoption reform advocates who were working to strengthen oversight of adoptive families. We partnered with organizations focused on preventing other forms of adoption abuse, sharing research and advocacy strategies to create comprehensive protections for vulnerable children. One of our most significant partnerships was with the National Center for Adoption Integrity, which had been working for decades to establish better screening and monitoring of adoptive families. Together, we developed training programs for social workers, court personnel, and financial institutions to help them identify potential inheritance fraud and other forms of exploitation. Aleida's story has helped us understand that financial abuse often accompanies other forms of neglect and maltreatment, explained Dr. Robert Chen, the center's research director. When adoptive parents are willing to steal from their children's inheritances, they're usually also failing to meet their children's emotional and medical needs. The Foundation's counseling program had become equally important as our legal services. Many of the adopted children we worked with had spent years believing they were the problem in their families, and learning about inheritance fraud often triggered complex emotions about identity, family loyalty, and self-worth. Recovery isn't just about getting the money back, Dr. Mitchell explained. It's about helping these young people understand that they deserve love, respect, and proper care. Many of them have never experienced healthy family relationships, so we have to help them learn what normal looks like. My own healing continued through my work with the foundation, but it also deepened through the relationships I was building outside of my professional life. I had started dating again, something that had been difficult when I believed I was worthless and had nothing to offer a partner. Understanding that my struggles had been artificially created by my adoptive parents' exploitation freed me to pursue genuine connections. I had also developed a close relationship with several staff members at the hospital where I had nearly died. Dr. Martinez had become a medical advisor for our foundation, helping us understand the health consequences of medical neglect in adoptive families. Patricia remained my closest friend and confidant, our bond forged through the experience of fighting for justice together. Perhaps most surprisingly, Jason and I had developed a real sibling relationship for the first time in our lives. He had kept his promise to make financial restitution, selling his house and car to repay the money he had received from my inheritance. More importantly, he had become an advocate for adoption reform, speaking publicly about the dangers of favoritism and financial abuse in adoptive families. I spent 25 years benefiting from my sister's exploitation, Jason said during one particularly moving speech to an adoption conference. I can't undo that damage, but I can use my experience to help other families recognize when favoritism crosses the line into abuse. Jason's willingness to acknowledge his complicity and work to make amends had allowed us to build a relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable children. He had also become a major donor to the foundation, using his salary from his new job to support our work. As the foundation approached its second year of operation, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed. 2 years earlier, I had been a woman dying alone in a hospital, believing that I was worthless and unwanted. Now I was leading an organization that was protecting children across the country and changing laws to prevent the kind of abuse I had suffered. The most remarkable thing about your story, Patricia observed during one of our planning meetings, is how you turned your worst experience into a source of strength that's helping other people. The work wasn't easy, and some days the stories we encountered were heartbreaking. But every child we helped recover stolen inheritance money, every law we helped pass to strengthen protections, and every family we helped understand their rights made the difficult journey worthwhile. I've learned that the people who abandon us often do us a favor by showing us we're strong enough to create our own path, I said during a keynote speech at the National Adoption Conference. My adoptive parents' neglect freed me from the obligation to protect their feelings and enabled me to fight for justice without guilt or hesitation. The Margaret Henderson Foundation had become more than a legal clinic. It was a community of survivors who supported each other through the complex process of healing from family betrayal and building new lives based on truth and genuine care. As I looked around the foundation's offices filled with dedicated staff members who had chosen to dedicate their careers to protecting vulnerable children, I realized that I had finally found the family I had been seeking my entire life. Not a family based on blood or legal obligation, but a family based on shared values, mutual support, and commitment to making the world safer for children who needed protection. The empty hospital bed that had terrified my adoptive parents had become the foundation for a life more meaningful and impactful than anything I could have imagined during my years of believing I was worthless. 3 years after the night I nearly died alone in the ICU while my adoptive parents celebrated Jason's promotion, I found myself standing at my grandmother Margaret's graveside holding flowers and feeling a profound sense of peace that would have been unimaginable during my darkest moments in that hospital bed. Thank you, Grandma, I whispered, placing white roses on her headstone. Thank you for giving me the strength to choose life and the wisdom to understand that some endings are actually beginnings. The woman who stood at that graveside was fundamentally different from the person who had been abandoned in the hospital 3 years earlier. I was no longer someone who begged for scraps of affection from people who saw me as an inconvenience. I had become someone who built meaningful relationships with people who chose to value my contributions and support my growth. The Margaret Henderson Foundation had grown beyond anything I had initially envisioned. We now operated in 26 states, had recovered over $40 million in stolen inheritance funds, and had helped pass comprehensive inheritance protection legislation that would prevent thousands of children from experiencing the kind of exploitation I had suffered. But more importantly than the professional success was the personal transformation I had experienced through the process of fighting for justice and building a life based on truth rather than lies. I had learned that my adoptive parents' abandonment, while devastating at the time, had actually been a gift that freed me from a toxic family dynamic that was slowly destroying my self-worth. Their choice to prioritize Jason's party over my life had revealed their true character so clearly that I could never again doubt whether their treatment of me was justified. The most important lesson I've learned, I said during my final keynote address at the National Adoption Conference, is that being chosen by people who truly value you is infinitely more meaningful than being born into a family that takes you for granted. My chosen family now included Patricia, who had become both my closest friend and my most trusted colleague, Dr. Martinez, who continued to monitor my health and had become a father figure I had never had, Sarah Brennan, who remained my attorney and had become a mentor who guided my professional development, and dozens of foundation staff members who shared my commitment to protecting vulnerable children. I had also developed romantic relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the desperate need for approval that had characterized my earlier attempts at dating. Understanding that I was worthy of love and respect had enabled me to attract partners who saw my strength rather than my vulnerability. Jason and I had maintained our renewed sibling relationship built on honesty about our past and shared commitment to preventing other families from repeating our destructive patterns. He had remarried someone who shared his values about family equality, and they were raising their children with the kind of fairness and respect that had been missing from our childhood. The relationship we have now is the relationship we should have had all along, Jason told me during our last conversation. It's based on choosing to care about each other, rather than being obligated to pretend everything is fine. My adoptive parents had served their prison sentences and had attempted several times to contact me through intermediaries seeking forgiveness and reconciliation. I had chosen not to respond to these overtures, not out of anger or resentment, but out of recognition that some betrayals are too fundamental to repair. Forgiveness doesn't mean having a relationship with people who have demonstrated that they cannot be trusted. Dr. Mitchell had helped me understand. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to forgive people from a distance while protecting yourself from further harm. I had visited my biological parents' graves for the first time, finally able to mourn the family I had lost and celebrate the legacy they had left for me. Reading their letters and watching their videos had given me a sense of identity and heritage that no amount of legal documentation could provide. Your biological parents would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become, Patricia had told me after we visited Robert and Catherine Walsh's gravesite together. You've honored their memory by using their gift to protect other children and build something meaningful with your life. The health challenges that had nearly killed me 3 years earlier were now well managed through proper medical care funded by my inheritance. Regular monitoring and preventive treatment had stabilized my condition, and I was healthier than I had been since childhood. It's remarkable how much better you've responded to treatment now that you're receiving care based on medical need rather than financial convenience, Dr. Martinez had observed during my recent checkup. Stress and neglect definitely exacerbate genetic conditions like yours. As I reflected on the journey from that ICU bed to the life I had built, I understood that my near-death experience had been exactly what I needed to break free from patterns of thinking and relating that were keeping me trapped in an abusive dynamic. Sometimes the people who abandon us do us the greatest favor by showing us we're strong enough to create our own path. I had written in my memoir, which was being published next month, to raise awareness about inheritance, fraud, and adoption abuse. The book's proceeds would fund expansion of the foundation's work into rural areas where adopted children had less access to legal resources and advocacy services. My story would reach thousands of people who might be experiencing similar exploitation, but had never understood that they had rights and options. The most powerful thing about your story, my publisher had told me, is how it demonstrates that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about building a life worth living based on your own values and choices. Looking back on that terrible night when I almost died alone, I could now see it as the moment when my real life began. The machines that had kept my body alive while my adoptive parents celebrated elsewhere had also been measuring the heartbeat of someone who was ready to fight for justice and build meaningful relationships. Every person deserves to be loved unconditionally and supported completely, I concluded my memoir. If the people who are supposed to provide that love and support choose not to do so, we have the right and the responsibility to find people who will. As I prepared to leave the cemetery after my visit with Grandma Margaret, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from knowing that my suffering had been transformed into something that protected other people from similar harm. The empty hospital bed that had represented my adoptive parents' ultimate abandonment had become the foundation for a life dedicated to ensuring that no other child would have to choose between family loyalty and personal survival. I had learned that family isn't defined by blood or legal documents, but by the people who choose to stand by you when you need them most, who celebrate your successes without competition, and who love you for who you are rather than what you can provide for them. The night I nearly died alone had taught me that I was strong enough to survive anything worthy enough to demand better treatment, and capable enough to build a life that honored both my biological parents' hopes and my own dreams for the future. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning, and that the courage to fight for justice often leads to discovering purposes and relationships we never could have imagined during our darkest moments. As I drove away from the cemetery and headed back to the foundation offices where my chosen family was working to protect vulnerable children, I felt grateful for every difficult step of the journey that had brought me to this place of peace, purpose, and genuine love. The woman who had been abandoned in that ICU had died that night, not physically, but emotionally. The woman who had been reborn in her place was someone who understood her worth, demanded respect, and used her strength to make the world safer for children who needed protection. That transformation had been worth every moment of pain, every tear shed, and every battle fought to reach this place of healing and hope. Thank you for joining me on this journey of survival justice and ultimately triumph. Your support means everything to survivors like me who are working to protect vulnerable children from exploitation and abuse. I want to hear from you. Have you or someone you know experienced favoritism or financial abuse in adoptive families? What signs do you think people should watch for to protect children from inheritance fraud? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like this video to help it reach other people who might need to hear this message. Many adopted children are suffering in silence because they don't understand their rights or know that help is available. Please subscribe to support more stories about justice recovery and standing up for what's right. Your subscription helps ensure that these important stories continue to reach people who need hope and guidance during their darkest moments. And please share this story with anyone who works with adoptive families' inheritance law or child protection. The more people who understand how inheritance fraud works, the better we can protect vulnerable children from exploitation. Remember, you are worthy of love, respect, and protection. No one has the right to exploit you regardless of their relationship to you or the legal power they hold over your life. Thank you for being part of a community that believes in justice, supports survivors, and works to protect children who cannot protect themselves. Together, we can ensure that no child has to choose between family loyalty and personal survival. May you find the courage to demand the love and respect you deserve, and may you always remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by the values you choose to live by and the people you choose to surround yourself with.